The story begins with events that happened 15 years ago. A crowd gathered on the streets of a crowded city. People whispered, asking what happened and who could help the poor woman. Near the carriage of the aristocrat, a barely conscious woman was lying on the cobblestones, covered in blood. Her daughter was with her. The girl did not leave her mother and called for help, but no one came to help. The young girl's name was Sapphire. The girl turned to her mother and asked her not to leave her alone and to hold on as long as she could until help came, and she understood that the condition was extremely difficult. The woman was lying on the cobblestones in a pool of blood and looked with tearful eyes at her daughter, who could not come to terms with this injustice. The mother said that she was glad that the child remained intact. Sapphire shouted to the woman in the carriage to help her mother immediately, because she was the one who had been knocked down in broad daylight and was now quietly watching the woman die. That haughty woman in the carriage just covered herself with her fan and contemptuously said that the woman was too dirty to help her and she was not going to do it at all. Stunned Sapphire just blinked her eyes, and the rich woman added that because of her dirty mother, the elegant carriage was contaminated with the blood of commoners, so they should leave here quickly. The carriage quickly moved from its place and drove away, and a stunned Sapphire sat and watched her mother die on the ground because someone just ran over her in broad daylight. Sapphire looked at her bloodied mother, who was dying before her eyes, and was seething with such injustice that aristocrats can take and beat commoners and go on their way. The girl fell on her mother, who was living the last seconds of her life, and hugged her tightly. Sapphire asked her mother not to leave her alone in this cruel and unfair world. Tears rolled from the eyes of the indignant young girl. On that day, she firmly decided that until the last day of her life, she would fiercely hate all the aristocrats because of whom her mother died. A year ago, a little boy was riding in a carriage. He was sitting in the luggage compartment next to the boxes. It was night on the street, and the boy closed his eyes so as not to hear the sound of the night, because he was very scared. The boy was an unwanted child in the family, so his natural mother did not care about him. She was always busy with her personal affairs and did not pay attention to the child. The boy's father was at work all the time, and there was such an impression that he did not notice at all how his son appeared in his life. The type of activity of his service required constant presence at the workplace. The dirty boy was in tears, and only thought that at least one person in the world would say that he was needed here. He resented the fact that everyone around him only hated him and did not pay attention to him. Two men were standing near the house. The first asked if he was sure that this was the house he wanted, and the partner assured that this is where his son has been kept for more than 2 months. The man thanked his partner for finding this house and personally bringing him here. After all, he was constantly busy and could not do it personally. The man clenched his hands into fists and mentally said that from now on, everything will be different. He apologized to David for making him wait so long and promised that such a mistake would not happen again. Therefore, this story is dedicated to these 3 people who lost the most valuable thing in their lives. And it is people who have lost everything in their lives who will eventually become a good family from which others could take an example. 2 months ago, in one of the estates of a wealthy aristocrat, the owner began to molest a frightened young maid. She tried to explain to him that she had to go, but he did not want to listen to her. The man leaned close over the young girl and began to promise her that as soon as she became his mistress, she would be immediately released from all the hard housework. Sapphire witnessed this harassment and watched it from the end of the corridor. The young woman begged to let her go, because she has a husband and a child, and that is why she could not be someone's lover. The owner explained that she should leave that poor beggar and pay attention to a man like him. Sapphire had already prepared a bucket of water and decided to help the frightened girl. A minute later, she poured hot water on the floor, soaking her husband as well. He was simply enraged and looked fiercely at the maid who allowed herself such an act. Sapphire bowed her head guiltily and apologized for such an incident. She explained that she was just cleaning the floor and accidentally spilled water, and that this would never happen again. But the master did not even want to listen to her explanation. He could no longer control his rage, so he raised his fist above his head. He shouted furiously that such foolish maids should pay in full for their concessions. A moment later, the fat man's fist landed on Sapphire's face. From such a strong, unexpected blow, the young girl fell to the floor and did not have the strength to get up. The man started kicking the fragile girl and shouted that she would still regret the fact that she damaged his clothes. And in general, He can throw her out on the street whenever he wants and take another one in her place. Finally, the proud owner shouted that he did not think of softening the punishment because she would just cry. He'll deduct the cost of the suit from her paycheck, so she'll think twice next time. When the man left, the maid ran up to Sapphire and asked how she was doing. She saw how that owner mercilessly beat the young girl and was very concerned about her well-being. Sapphire barely got up from the floor, wiped the blood from her face, and smiled at her partner. The girl said that she was glad that the maid was unharmed and that she intervened in time. The girl with tears on her face thanked Sapphire and said that she was very impressed that the girl helped her, despite the fact that her salary would be cut so much. Sapphire smiled once more and said that there is nothing wrong with that. Then she offered to go back to work until that angry owner saw them standing idle. The maid suggested that Sapphire get some rest as she needed to recover from such a beating, and offered to do all her work for her as a token of appreciation. That's what they decided to do. The maid went to get the cleaning equipment because she had double work around the house waiting for her, and Sapphire went to rest a little. As Sapphire headed to her room to get some rest, she saw the displeased face of the haughty owner in the window. He caused her disgust and hatred. The young girl was not going to forgive the fact that someone raised a hand on her, especially such a scum like this man. So already at night she was standing with a pile of securities in his office. Sapphire said out loud with satisfaction that she had proof of the theft in her hands, and she had finally achieved her goal. In this way, the perpetrator will be justly punished. She did not understand how it is possible to use the taxes of people who pay them with their own sweat and blood so dishonestly, because they are given to them so hard. The young girl pondered over this question, and in her head only curse words appeared in the direction of such scum. That is why she took the side of justice to punish them. Then she heard the voices of men shouting that their financial report had disappeared, and without it, they were in trouble. They wondered aloud whether it was the handiwork of the mysterious angel. The men shouted that it was impossible to let her escape and quickly ran down the corridor. At that time, the angel smiled sweetly and told them to consider this as compensation for beating her. A minute later, she jumped out of the window with the documents in her hand. Finally, Sapphire shouted loudly that she would take back what rightfully belonged to the common people. Everyone in their city already knew about Angel, who stole evidence of crimes committed by unscrupulous aristocrats and handed them over to the police so that they would be justly punished. He was a noble thief who returned all the loot back to ordinary poor people. She sneaked into the houses of aristocrats under the guise of a maid and learned in detail all the necessary information about their crimes. Therefore, Sapphire Cromwell had a very big secret, which no one in this world should know about, because otherwise her noble deeds would come to an end. But when the young girl landed near the estate, she noticed that a small boy was looking at her from the bushes. She mentally cursed that someone had noticed her and approached him. When the girl looked into his tearful eyes, she realized that this boy did not pose any danger to her life. He looked very sick, and his eyes were full of tears. Sapphire mentally analyzed the situation and realized that he was unlikely to call for help. Moreover, she was worried about the boy's appearance. The guy looked at the stranger with huge surprised eyes and did not know what to do. The young girl thought that something was clearly wrong with him and decided to find out what it was. Sapphire came closer to him and asked in a sweet voice what he was doing here. She greeted and counted on friendly relations from the little boy. But the boy covered his head with his hands and began to scream loudly. Through tears, he asked the girl not to beat him because he had done nothing wrong. But when the girl came closer to him, the boy, not even proving the phrase to the end, fainted and fell into her arms. She barely managed to catch him on the fly. When she touched the little boy's forehead, she realized that he had a high temperature. The guy was almost unconscious. The young girl's heart clenched in pain in her chest, and she took the poor boy in her arms. Of course, the girl could not leave him alone, especially in such a difficult condition. Sapphire held the little boy in her arms and hugged him close. At that moment, she hesitated whether she was doing the right thing, and she did not have time to think too long. The decision came naturally, and she ran as fast as possible down the street with the child in her arms, because the pursuit arranged by the aristocrat was already very close, stepping on her heels. Sapphire barely had time to hide behind the house when she heard male voices discussing that Angel had recently run out of the mansion and headed down this street. One of the men expressed disbelief that it was really an angel. Another objected, saying that her costume was quite famous among the inhabitants of this city, and that she could not be confused with anyone. But the chief among them said that despite the fact that she is an angel, she is still a thief, and they must follow the letter of the law and conduct an investigation, as a result of which the guilty will be punished. The men could barely keep up with their boss, and said as they ran that he was very serious about this matter. He replied that he was just doing his duty. The young girl looked out from the corner of the house and carefully studied those men who had already reached the end of the street. She recognized their boss. This man was also known by every resident of the city, and it was the chief of police, Chris Galbraith. Sapphire got goosebumps when she realized who was stalking her. The police were organized by order of the king to control crime in the empire. Mostly, it all consisted of aristocrats who were personally subordinate to the prime minister. Therefore, Sapphire knew very well that they did not pay much attention to the crimes of the aristocrats and constantly covered them up. The young girl firmly knew that she could not fall into their hands. Some time later, a cheerful boy dressed in clean, beautiful clothes was playing with a sword in Sapphire's kitchen. He shouted cheerfully that he would now dispose of the lemon in one blow. The young girl made a remark that playing with food is ugly, and the boy agreed with Sapphire. Then the little one added that the White Lily Festival would take place very soon. The boy's name was David, and he cheerfully said that when he grows up, he will definitely become a knight of the White Lily and make his mother the happiest woman in this world. The young girl smiled and asked the boy if he had not forgotten his promise to meet his real parents soon. After these words, the boy thought, and then asked the young girl if his mother loved his David. These words shocked the young girl. She didn't expect anyone to call her mom. It was cute and joyful and strange and scary at the same time. The girl replied that of course she loved David. The boy said that in that case he would not rush to his real parents. Sapphire could not fall in love with the little boy. As soon as she brought him home, the boy began to recover little by little. Every day he became stronger and healthier, but he did not remember anything about the angel or his parents. The boy helped Sapphire around the house, and with his appearance in her house, life became much more interesting. But the activities of her secret angel were put on hold for now. They continued to chat happily during dinner when they suddenly heard a knock at the door. Surprised, Sapphire asked who was there and went to open the door herself. As soon as the door opened and the young girl saw who was standing on her doorstep, she almost lost consciousness from the shock. She clearly did not expect to see this in her own house. The police chief himself stood at the door. He apologized for coming to her so suddenly and introduced himself by saying his name, Chris Galbraith. The young girl blinked her eyes and could not utter a word. She was waiting for what the chief of police, who was also one of the most famous representatives of the aristocratic family, would ask next. He then asked her if she was really Sapphire Cromwell. Before answering this question, the young girl immediately thought that now her secret was revealed and he came for her. Little David heard his mother talking loudly with someone on the doorstep and decided to see who came. He looked through the open door and asked his mother what the man needed. Chris looked at the baby and, surprised, called his name. David. He couldn't contain his joy because he finally managed to find his own son after so long. But the boy was afraid that the man knew his name and hid behind his mother's skirt. Sapphire also did not expect that the police chief knew the child's name and looked at him in surprise. Then the young woman pulled herself together and sternly asked Chris what he needed here and how he knew the name of this kid. The chief of the police began to tell that this boy, named David, was his own son and he had come to take him home. Of course, the young girl did not expect to hear such an explanation. She opened her mouth in surprise and now only wondered why the police chief had come to her house. The man explained that more than a year ago, his son disappeared from home and he spent all that time looking for him. Finally, he managed to track him down and found himself at her house. Chris held out his hand to the little boy and said that now Dad would be with him all the time and offered to go to their house. But the boy was even more frightened and began to shout that he was not going anywhere. David hid behind a young girl and shouted to a man he did not know that he would not go anywhere without his mother and wanted to stay with her because only here he felt needed and loved. Chris asked where he got that this woman was his mother. Sapphire decided to intervene in the conversation and explained that she found the boy when he was sick and worried about him as if he were her own son. The chief of police said that he would certainly conduct an investigation to find out whether she had kidnapped this child. When David heard this, he began to shout that it was unfair because his mother had saved him. Chris looked at his son in surprise and did not know how to take him home, because he saw that the boy did not want to return without this young woman who treated him so well. Chris then said that since his son did not want to part with this young woman, he could offer her a job in his house so that she would stay close to him. But Sapphire politely replied that she refuses this offer, and her decision at this stage is final. Working in the police chief's house was not part of her plans at all. She worked as a maid in the estates of many aristocrats, and only to collect secret information about their malicious lives for her secret work. The young girl was very careful about these tasks, so she did not stay for a long time in one estate so that no one could remember her face. But the police chief explained that it would be quite rude of him to simply hire a maid to his house to save his own son, so she misunderstood his proposal. And Chris didn't hesitate to ask Miss Sapphire Cromwell to become his wife and the mother of this wonderful boy David, so that they could be together in his estate. The police chief explained that his son lost his mother very early, and the second wife, whom he took shortly after the death of the first, treated him quite cruelly. She constantly beat the poor boy, that staying in the house of his native family became an unbearable test for him. Father was constantly busy at work at that time, and one day, when there was a strong thunderstorm on the street, the boy ran away from home, and since then no one knew anything about him, because where he went could only be guessed. Chris was very worried that his son had been kidnapped and was constantly looking for any clues to find his David. And finally, he found him at her house. Chris chastised himself for not listening to the child's wishes when he was still near him, but now he was not going to repeat such a mistake, so he decided to do something like this. The young man bowed to the Sapphire and said that he very much begged her to accept his proposal, because he wanted his son to be close to the person who had become so close to him. Then the young girl thought, because she understood that the boy was really attached to her and considered her his own mother, and it would be very painful for him to part with her, she looked into the eyes of the boy who was looking at her with such a pleading look. In his eyes there was just a cry for her to stay by his side. The young girl patted the boy on the head and decided that she simply had no moral right to leave him after he believed that someone needed him in this life. Then the young woman looked at the chief of police and decided that being next to him would be a good opportunity to control the movement of the police and to be aware of all the rights and the city. Sapphire decided that this would be a good opportunity to ease her secret investigations and decided not to neglect such an offer. Then the young girl looked into the eyes of the chief of police and said that she accepts his offer, but on her terms. She will only be a mother for David, not Chris's wife. After she and David moved to Chris's residence, Sapphire was surrounded by maids who tried to please their landlady, one offering tea, the other to fix her hair. When the maid was doing a nice hairstyle for Sapphire, the young girl could not guess that she was the hostess here. She felt quite uncomfortable and could not get used to such a role. The young girl took a cup of tea in her hands and thought that she could not compose herself, and it was so necessary that no one could guess about her secret life. Usually, it was in such rich estates that she did all the hard work. She washed the floors, chopped firewood, cooked food, cleaned, and now she just sits idle and doesn't know what to do. It was rather unusual for her to feel when so many maids were circling around her, and each one tried to please her new owner by offering her various types of entertainment. It was like a new kind of torture for Sapphire. The young girl decided that she would definitely endure all the tests in order for the boy to feel comfortable here with the person who loves him. David constantly said that he was very happy that his mother was now with him in his house and that he had never felt so happy in his life. These words were like a sip of cold water to a thirsty person. The boy felt more comfortable here, and Sapphire decided that although he had lost his memory, he had quickly adapted to life in the aristocratic estate of the chief of police. The little boy told the maid that the tea was quite tasty and asked her to bring some more cakes for him and for his mother so that they could taste it together at breakfast today. Of course, the maid was glad to have the opportunity to please the young duke in any way, so she happily said that now she would definitely bring the most delicious cookies available in their estate. The maid then informed Sapphire that the bath was ready and asked if the young lady would need help bathing. Sapphire thought and did not know what to answer. The girl, of course, wanted to take a bath alone, as she had done it before, but according to etiquette in aristocratic houses, it was not accepted that way, and the bath had to be taken in the presence of maids. Sapphire felt quite uncomfortable and tried to somehow cover her naked body. A red blush appeared on her cheeks from the shame that someone was looking at her naked. She was constantly helped to dress, comb her hair, And most of all, she did not like it when her naked body was wiped after a bath. She wanted to fall through the ground from shame. Sapphire thanked her maids for preparing such a nice bath for her every day. But the maids replied that they were not used to receiving gratitude for such their daily work. When the young girl looked at the pieces of soap, she noticed that they sparkled like precious stones. This surprised Sapphire, and she said it out loud. The maid happily explained to the young landlady that this soap was made by special order for the Duke from a very rare flower that grew in a distant country. Sapphire thought that, of course, she did not expect anything else from the Duke. It was a common thing when even soap was made to order for aristocrats. Still, Sapphire was amazed that such a small piece had a unique aroma and was so shiny. She was impressed by the skill of the soap maker. Finally, the young girl was left alone in the evening and decided to put her thoughts in order. There were so many of them in her head that she no longer understood where reality was due to such stormy events. But even here she could not be left alone, because after a moment someone called her. She turned her head. In front of her stood another maid with a precious box in her hands. When the maid came closer to the young owner, she opened the box, and there was just an incredible amount of precious jewelry that sparkled incredibly beautifully. The maid informed that it was a gift from the Duke, and maybe she would find something special for herself there to complement her image tomorrow, emphasizing her beauty. The maid happily announced that the Duke, as such a precious gift, had decided to give it to Sapphire as a sign of his hospitality. The girl was amazed by the number of jewels. Chris was in his office at the time. Over the past few days, a lot of urgent matters had accumulated that needed immediate resolution, and he decided to tackle them. But his thoughts flew somewhere very far from these matters. The young man pondered the recent events and the new girl who began to live in his estate as David's mother. His ex-wife was so greedy that she constantly demanded new jewels, clothes, valuables, and money from the Duke. But at first, the Duke made a terrible mistake and did not pay attention to it. Therefore, he did not want to fall into the same circumstances again, and decided, no matter how much he did not want it, to test the new mother for his son in this way, waiting for her to show her true nature. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door. His assistant ran in and reported that another abduction had taken place in the shelter. The police chief loudly asked for details and dressed as he went. He couldn't afford to make another fatal mistake, so he shouted to his assistant to urgently prepare the transport, because they had to go to the scene of the crime immediately. That day, the chief of police returned to his estate very late. He was extremely tired because the day had been quite busy, and he had been constantly working on the kidnapping case. On the way to his office, he thought he'd gone there as soon as he learned of the crime, but they never managed to track down the culprit, who fled rather quickly. The young man thought that the case would have gone much faster if the director of the orphanage had been a little kinder to the police and told more details about the crime. When the police chief's hand touched the door handle, he thought that he would finally rest after such a stressful day. But as soon as the door opened, he was shocked by what he saw there. Sapphire was sitting on the sofa in his room, looking at the Duke. She said that she has been waiting for him here for quite a long time because she has an urgent conversation and she is finally glad that he has come home. The shocked chief of police asked the young girl why she wanted to inform him so urgently at such a late hour, because it had been a long time since she had a sweet dream in her bed. When Chris sat down on the sofa opposite the young lady, she informed him that the reason for the conversation would be his hospitality, which he had shown today through the maid. But Sapphire was more interested in the crime in the children's shelter, so she informed the Duke that she had heard of this crime and would like to know more information about it. The police chief replied that he could not share such information with outsiders, and Sapphire added that the director of the orphanage hates aristocrats and is unlikely to cooperate with him. Then Chris asked the young girl how she knew about the director of the shelter and asked her to tell everything she knew about her. Sapphire said that in the early days, when she had to work very hard to feed herself and David, she left the little one in the orphanage to be looked after. David stayed with the local children until the end of her working day, and she is so grateful for their help that she would like to thank them for their kindness in not leaving her at such a difficult time. But the police chief replied that it would be better for more experienced professionals to deal with all this and that she did not need to interfere in this matter. Moreover, it is not clear how it can end for the girl. That young girl objected to the police chief and said that she could not sit idly by when the children in the children's shelter were in danger, because she also knew all of them. The police chief was very impressed by the words. He did not expect to hear such a thing from a young girl and looked at her more closely. Then he agreed to talk briefly about the abduction. The girl decided to clarify and asked whether the news about the kidnapping really reached the police too late, because that was what she understood from his story about the kidnapping. Chris confirmed that it is precisely because of the late reporting that it is very difficult to find traces of the crime. But he is even more concerned about the fact that similar abductions are taking place in other children's shelters. He told Sapphire that he tried to find out more details from the director of the shelter, but she was quite skeptical of the police officers and told him almost nothing. Sapphire listened attentively to the police chief's story, and then a brilliant idea flashed in her head. At first, she hesitated whether she should tell the rich duke about it, and there was nothing to lose. Sapphire told the chief of police that she had one idea how to help him in this case, and he impatiently asked what exactly came to the girl's mind. Then the young girl explained that she is not used to wearing such expensive jewelry and exquisite dresses, so she feels uncomfortable in them and considers them superfluous in her daily wardrobe. Therefore, she offered to donate the amount that he does not spend on jewelry and jewelry to the orphanage where the abduction took place recently. Of course, Chris did not expect to hear such an offer from the lips of a young girl, so he asked several more times whether she was sure of her decision, and Sapphire answered that she was definitely sure. When they arrived at the children's shelter the next day, they were met by a nun who said that the director would come out to meet them now and asked her to wait a little. The police chief watched through the window how the children from the children's shelter were playing with his own son on the street. Of course, they knew each other, because he spent a lot of time here while Sapphire went to work. They were happy to see each other, because they hadn't seen each other for a long time, and were cheerfully talking about what had happened to them during that time. Chris noted that David was good at finding a common language with the local children. The young girl agreed that he was playing well with them, and asked Chris if he was sure of his decision that they should take David with them to this business meeting. Chris said that it was David's decision because he really wanted to see his old friends and play with them again, so he brought him along. The children were playing in the yard at the mysterious angel, who carried out justice on the evil aristocrats and were the main characters in this game in turn. Therefore, everyone was impatiently waiting for their turn. As Sapphire walked past the children and heard them playing, she thought to herself that now was a bad time to play Mysterious Angel in the presence of the police chief. Chris expressed his opinion that the angel is quite popular among the common people, and it is difficult to argue with that. But then the police chief added that in any case, the angel remains a criminal, and as soon as she is caught, she cannot escape execution. A cold sweat ran down Sapphire's back at his words. Meanwhile, the chief of police added that it is difficult to ignore the fact that for these children, an angel is a real hero. The nanny joined their fun game, and it was her turn to be the main character. All the children surrounded the nanny and waited for what she would now offer. Then the young girl asked Chris if it was true that this angel was very difficult to catch. She heard it from the conversations of local residents, because rumors about the angel spread much faster than his actions. And the chief of the police assured with confidence that the investigation is moving forward, and sooner or later they will manage to catch this intruder and at the same time reveal her identity. The thought pulsated in Sapphire's mind that as soon as Angel was caught, she would be executed immediately, so she decided not to put herself in danger in the near future. Meanwhile, the director of the children's shelter approached the young people and apologized for the fact that they had to wait for her for some time. Her assistant was also with her. Chris thanked the woman for agreeing to cooperate with him, and the headmistress, in turn, thanked him for the generous donation that came to their account in recent days. The headmistress invited the chief of police to go to her office and chat about everything in more detail. Chris willingly agreed to go with the woman because he had a lot of questions for her. Sapphire and the assistant headmistress watched as Chris and the woman walked to the end of the corridor and back to the office of the headmistress of the children's shelter. The assistant turned to Sapphire and said that this donation on the eve of the White Lily Festival would be very useful to the orphanage because they did not know where to get the funds for it. Sapphire asked the assistants whether the festival really needed so much money, and the woman said that it would take quite a large sum to hold it. The White Lily Festival was dedicated to the White Lily Goddess and at the same time the patroness of this country. The Princess of the White Lily and the Knight of the White Lily were elected from among the people. The Knight of the White Lily had to pierce the lemon with his sword so that juice would flow from it, while the Princess of the White Lily had to wash herself with this juice, which meant the removal of all troubles. Then the Princess of the White Lily gave a symbolic flower to the goddess herself, saying words of thanks for the fact that they lived successfully last year and asking for a blessing to live the same way in the next one. Sapphire knew that during the celebration, a lot of goodies in the form of lilies and lemons should be prepared, and quite a lot of money from the children's shelter budget was spent on this. All employees of the children's shelter were convinced that all aristocrats without exception are very arrogant and cannot be trusted. But such a generous donation was quite unusual. Sapphire and the assistant watched how the director and the chief of police talked, and the young girl was happy that thanks to her idea, it was possible to arrange this meeting. It was at that moment that the director of the shelter said that she should not be so prejudiced against the chief of police, since he had made such a generous donation to their children's shelter. Sapphire could not even believe that she was hearing such words from the headmistress, because she always said that aristocrats should not be trusted and thought about the fact that Chris might be someone else. Already that night, the young girl dressed in rather inconspicuous clothes and decided to leave the estate inconspicuously. She decided to go through the garden so as not to cause too much noise. Sapphire decided that now she could leave David alone with peace of mind, because she was convinced that he was very well taken care of and she could go back to her secret work. Moreover, today they managed to talk with the director of the children's shelter, who told some details of all these crimes. The director informed in which shelters the abductions took place, and Sapphire came to the conclusion that they were nothing like the usual ones, and she had to figure it out on her own. Sapphire assumed that very rich aristocrats might be involved in this crime, so she was now very much at risk of being caught red-handed. At that moment, she remembered the last words of her mother, who was dying at the hands of another aristocrat who did not care about poor people. These words were always with the girl, to always be strong and honest. Then the young girl decided that she was doing the right thing and had to help poor children, because it was not worth hoping for the help of the police, which was formed for the aristocrats. Sapphire cautiously looked around, checking that no one was watching her, and thought that first of all she needed to get out of here inconspicuously, which she would do immediately. The young girl did not have time to take the first step when she heard someone sneaking up behind her. The girl decided not to run, but to find out who dared to follow her. A voice from the darkness shouted quite loudly, asking who was here, and the young girl realized that she had heard this male voice before. She turned around and saw Chris standing in front of her with a displeased expression on his face. At that moment, Sapphire thought that she was caught, and it would be quite difficult to get out of this situation. Chris repeated his question sternly. He demanded an answer from the girl what she was doing here at such a late hour. Sapphire was sure that if he finds out that she is an angel, he will immediately execute her. Out of the corner of her eye, the young girl noticed the amazing flowers around her, and the first thing that came to her mind, she said that she was enjoying the aroma of moonflowers. Chris looked at her in surprise. Sapphire added that moonflowers are used in perfumery because of their intoxicating aroma, but on a moonlit night they smell even more pronounced. That is why she came to enjoy this smell. Chris looked at the girl, and in his opinion, the explanation looked quite plausible, although when he saw her at such a late hour, he had completely different reasons for her being here. The young man asked Sapphire if she knew a lot about different types of flowers. The young girl answered with pleasure that she loves flowers, so she knows a lot of information about them. Then the police chief asked why she was dressed like that for a walk in the garden, and this question confused the young girl. She began to chaotically go through the answer options in her head. Then Sapphire quickly explained that although she is quite cool in a light evening dress, she likes the evening wind to air her body, and that is why she dressed like that. At that moment, Sapphire thought, if it is necessary for the girl to easily get rid of uncomfortable questions, then the best way is to say something completely awkward, and this is exactly what she always used. Then the young man said that he thought that she had decided to meet her lover, and that was why she had left their estate at such a late hour. That's why he followed her into the garden. Sapphire did not expect such an assumption from a young man, so she was indignant and angrily asked him where he took what from. She went to meet her lover. The young lady explained that although they are quite an odd couple, she is well aware that she is currently in the position of a duchess and should behave accordingly. Sapphire displeasedly said that even if she had a lover, she would not agree to marry the duke. Then she asked if he thought that ordinary people should not be trusted. And despite the fact that aristocrats have a completely different opinion in relation to ordinary people, she still does not allow herself to live according to some wrong principles. The young man felt uncomfortable that he even thought such thoughts. He saw Sapphire's reaction and tried to find some explanation for his actions. But the young man never came up with anything better than asking for forgiveness. So he bowed his head and said that he was too rude to Sapphire, for which he apologizes. Sapphire looked at Chris and thought that he had accused her without any reason. She thought that this is how aristocrats behave with ordinary people, and she was surprised that he bowed his head. At that moment, the young girl was convinced that she managed to find a believable excuse, and he did not suspect that she was actually an angel. So Sapphire said aloud that she accepted the apology. Finally, the girl added that she really likes to walk through the night gardens, so he should not be surprised when he sees her here next time. But she could swear that she would never betray. Chris was happy with such a promise from his new wife and noted that it was somehow inconvenient to address his husband by his title. Therefore, the Duke asked him to call him by his first and last name. The young girl decided to clarify that she does not play the role of his wife, but most likely fulfills the duties of David's mother, so it is not worth paying attention to such trifles. But the police chief promised that he would also call her by her name in return, so that more friendly relations would develop between them. And Sapphire agreed to such conditions of their joint residence. The next morning, the young girl thought about the fact that she had almost run into the chief of police last night, and she should be more careful in the future. But she was interested in the question why he suspected her of treason. Sapphire assumed that the young man had such and such an assumption because of her clothes, because she was wearing a rather light evening dress. But then she decided that the chief of police should not have made such hasty conclusions, because it was the very last thing that came to her mind when she saw a person in such a situation. That is why Sapphire decided to find out the answer to this question on her own, and in the only 100% way she knew, it was to listen to what his servants had to say about it. In the kitchen, the young girl witnessed a conversation between two cooks who were discussing the personal life of the young Duke. They said that Irene's ex-wife was just a horrible person. The cook added that even after marriage, she did not stop meeting with several men at the same time and cheated on the Duke with a new lover almost every night. Sapphire learned from the men in the stable that the ex-wife did not pay attention to whether her lovers had wives and children. In addition, little David got a lot from her. Two maids, who were talking in the garden about the life of their master, told each other that as soon as the Duke found out about her betrayals, he said that she should not be expected to love someone. Having witnessed such conversations of the servants during the whole day, in the evening, Sapphire sat down on a bench in the garden and began to analyze everything so that she could learn about the ex-wife of the police chief. And according to the comments that the Duke's servants had made about her, Sapphire concluded that the Duke's ex-wife was still that rare scumbag. The girl put herself in the Duke's place and understood that it was no wonder why he immediately suspected her of treason as soon as he saw her in the garden at such a late hour. She thought that she herself would have done the same. In other words, having received such a bitter experience in married life with his ex-wife, it was not surprising that the Duke could not trust any woman. Despite this, he made an offer to a commoner. The question remained as to how he decided to do this, and the only answer was that he cared about the comfort of his son David. After analyzing all of this information, Sapphire decided that there was something she needed to do before she left this estate. The young girl decided that to begin with, she needed to improve the relationship between father and son, and then, with a calm soul, break up with David and leave them in their own house. The next morning, the young girl suggested that the Duke and David have breakfast together. They sat down together at the dining table, which the maids had already elegantly served, preparing for breakfast. The little boy could not understand why from today they should have breakfast together, and looked with huge surprised eyes at his husband and at his mother. There was a tense atmosphere at the table, and everyone looked at each other in silence. Then Sapphire decided to be the first to break the silence and offered the Duke to start a conversation with his son. The young man was confused, cleared his throat, and asked if David really did not remember him at all. The boy blinked and looked at his mother. The young girl nodded to her son that he should maintain a conversation with his father, and he briefly replied that he did. The Duke then added that he was David's biological father. The boy once again nodded his head, looked from under his forehead at the man, and said that he had already told him about this before. Sapphire watched such a tense conversation between her husbands and was simply shocked at how deadlocked their relationship was. She thought that her relatives had not seen each other for more than a year, and when they met, they did not even know what to say to each other. Sapphire saw that the Duke did not know how to continue the conversation with his own son. Therefore, Sapphire decided that while she remains in the Duke's house, she should fix their relationship. and in this regard, she already had several ideas. Then the young girl got up from the table and offered to show an example of how to communicate with a child. The Duke looked incredulously at the young girl and asked what kind of example this was supposed to be. Sapphire invited the young man to kneel on the floor and did the same herself. They stood facing each other like that, looking into each other's eyes. The Duke felt quite uncomfortable because he had not been in such a stupid position for a long time when he did not know what to expect from this unknown girl. He decided to trust her and waited for further instructions. Sapphire looked into his eyes and smiled. Only she knew what was waiting for him next. The young girl looked at the Duke with a sweet look and said that when adults talk to small children, the look should be just like that. Then the children will have a trusting relationship. Sapphire explained that even adults pay attention to the facial expression with which they are addressed, and children do so 100 times more because they trust feelings more than the words of adults. The young man carefully listened to all the advice that Sapphire told him and tried to repeat the same look as she showed him. But this was only the first part of the task. Then the young girl got up from the floor, reached out her hands to the little boy, and called his name. A cute smile appeared on her face, and David immediately responded to her gesture. The boy's eyes widened with joy. He also held out his arms and shouted the word "Mom" cheerfully. David was ready to immediately run to meet her, and she did not think to stop him. When the little boy ran to Sapphire, they hugged each other tightly and began to say gentle words to each other. Chris watched from the sidelines and had never seen his son so happy. The young girl took the boy by the face and asked why he is becoming cuter and cuter every day, because she cannot be satisfied with her son. He smiled and said that he loves her. An even bigger smile appeared on Sapphire's face, because such words from David gave her confidence that she was doing everything correctly. She lifted her little son in her arms and began to circle him. The Duke's mouth fell open in surprise. He decided to clarify with the young girl whether it is always necessary to answer his son's questions exactly as she did just now. The young girl tightly hugged the satisfied boy and explained to the Duke that no matter how the child answers or asks, he must always talk about his feelings for his son. Sapphire caressed a young little boy and recommended his father to constantly give the child tactile contact because it makes children feel needed and not alone. The Duke kept his eyes on the young girl as she skillfully talked and played with David. He caught her every word and movement and tried to remember such useful tips for his relationship with his son. During his life, which he spent next to his own son, he only remembered that David was a constantly obedient boy who studied. The son was focused and persistent. The Duke watched his son's eyes light up with happiness as David spoke to Sapphire. He never even guessed that his son could be so happy and never noticed that he was smiling. Therefore, the young man admitted that he misbehaved with small boys and said that he never even noticed how lonely he was with his parents in such a big house. The young girl noticed that Chris had finally realized what he had done wrong with his son, and said loudly that the Duke should not repeat such a mistake again. David hugged his mother tightly and looked at his husband with huge eyes. He heard Sapphire tell his father that she was sure he would be able to convey his feelings to his son and understand him. The young girl was sure that an incredibly good relationship would develop between him because they are one family. Chris listened to the girl's advice and moved closer to his son. Now it became clearer to the Duke how to behave with his son, and he appreciated such useful advice from a girl he did not know. After all, he did not think that their relationship depends on this. And then, the Duke wondered what kind of family the girl herself had, if she had such vast experience in how to deal with small children. Suddenly, the young girl's mood changed, and he noticed how her incredibly beautiful eyes were filled with sadness. She began to tell that her father died very early, and she stayed with her mother. They lived quite poorly and constantly made ends meet. But she did not complain at all about the living conditions, because her mother gave her child so much love that Sapphire was still enough. The young girl said that together with her mother, they decided what dress the mother would sew for the child, what food they would cook together, and what their small family budget would be spent on. But once the mother protected her own daughter, at the moment when a carriage almost ran over her. Unfortunately, the woman herself did not manage to save herself and did not survive that day. It was very difficult for Sapphire to remember the events of that fateful day, so she decided to share her memories with the Dukes. The girl told how she sat next to her mother, who was dying right on the road. The young girl told how she desperately called for help from all caring people, but no one came to help the poor woman. She clearly remembered how the aristocrat who was sitting in the carriage that hit her mother to death was worried only that her transport was contaminated with blood, and she was disgusted by the life of a simple person. That aristocrat just went off to do her daily business, and then the young girl shouted that she hated all aristocrats and would definitely take revenge on them someday. The girl continued her story, and although it was difficult for her to remember the events of that day, although a rather large period of time had passed, and Sapphire remembered every minute. The young girl remembered that almost when she was completely consumed by the thirst for revenge, her own mother stopped her. Taking her last breath, she asked her daughter that there was no need to take revenge. The dying mother explained to her daughter that if she hated the aristocrats, she would be no better than them, who in their lives also hated the commoners. The girl looked at her mother with eyes full of tears. And she told me with the last of her strength that there is no need to get your hands dirty with such dirty things, because they are not worth it. The last words that the mother said to her daughter before her death were that the young girl had to stay strong and live right all the time. They remained forever in Sapphire's memory. After these words, the mother left this world, her daughter, her building, and went to heaven, leaving the young girl alone in this cruel world. Everyone knew that in their world there was a huge gap between the rich and the poor. That's why she was a girl and became a thief who was called an angel. She began to punish dishonest aristocrats, and the young girl gave their not-stolen wealth to families who needed it most. But the young girl decided not to tell the police chief about this story because she knew how he felt about the thief, called an angel. Out loud, the young girl said that, to be honest, she still dislikes aristocrats. It was because of this story that her mother died because of the aristocrat. Chris kept his eyes on the young girl, and he was also hurt by her words. He saw how hard it was for Sapphire to remember the events of the distant past. Sapphire also added that you shouldn't judge a person only by their social status, because you need to find out what a person really is inside, and that's exactly what her mother taught her. Finally, the young girl added that since then, she has been trying to keep the promise she made to her dying mother, and to stay strong and live right. The man looked at Sapphire with understanding and said that he understood everything. The girl, in turn, wondered if she had said something unnecessary towards the aristocrats, because he belonged to them. Therefore, she apologized for her frank conversation and added that she did not want to offend the Duke himself, because he belonged to an aristocratic family. But the young man did not pay attention to the fact that he himself belongs to the aristocrats, but simply summed up her story and said that Sapphire had an incredible mother. When Sapphire looked at Chris with surprise, he explained that her mother protected her at the cost of her own life, and even more, she did not allow her daughter to follow the path of revenge and gave such valuable life advice. The young man added that everything her mother did during her life, she did for her daughter, and he is very sorry that such a person died so early. Sapphire was surprised that even though she insulted Chris for his social affiliation, he didn't get angry and even praised her mom. Sapphire understood that Chris is an aristocrat, and first of all, he should side with the aristocrats. Despite this, he never reproached the girl for being a commoner. The young man immediately decided to take Sapphire's advice and looked at David with the look he had just learned. And then he came closer to him and stroked his head. Sapphire couldn't help but admire how her father started talking to David, and thought for a moment that maybe he was different from the many aristocrats she had met. Chris then looked at the young girl and said that he had a request for her. When she asked which one, Chris explained that he wanted her to be his partner at the next prom. Sapphire blinked in surprise and began to make excuses that she had never been to a ball and did not even know how to behave there. The girl began to explain to the Duke that there was no need to invite a girl who was indifferent to him to the ball, so she did not see any sense in this invitation. Moreover, Sapphire thought that what was the point of inviting to the ball a girl with whom he had to break up soon, and even more so, a girl who does not belong to his social position at all. But the young man completely stunned Sapphire, saying that this is why he wants the young girl to go to the ball with him in the status of his legal wife. In the estate of a wealthy aristocrat, Lady Angel was looking through his documents. She thought that she had finally managed to get away unnoticed with Galbraith's estate. Sapphire was already bored and wanted to start her secret task as soon as possible. After looking through a pile of documents, she did not find any information about the abduction, so she became upset. As she left the manor, she thought that she was still waiting for the damn ball that Chris had invited her to. She was very concerned that this secular event would not interfere with her secret activities. The young girl recalled the events that had happened in the Galbraith mansion a few days before, when the chief of police had persuaded her to be a partner in a social event as his legal wife. Then Sapphire was very scared, because she did not know how to behave at those parties for the rich and tried to properly refuse the young duke. The boy held his mother's hand and supported him as best he could. Meanwhile, the duke gave the girl irrefutable arguments. If she is David's mother, then she is also the Duchess of the Galbraith house. And if she confirms all these arguments, then she is also the duke's legal wife. Sapphire looked at him with a surprised look and just nodded her head. The young duke understood that his persuasion and arguments had no effect on the young girl, who was categorical in her decision. Then he became sad and looked at her with a sad look. When his gaze met that of the young girl, she shuddered in surprise. She looked at the police chief's face, and it was one-on-one with David's face as he begged her for something. Sapphire was amazed at such a 100% similarity. Of course, she could not refuse a person who looked at her in such a way, and the boy knew this very well and always used it. Now Chris Galbraith found out her weak side. Lady Angel strode back to the Galbraith estate and remembered how she had finally agreed, and how delighted the Duke had been, and how delighted little David had been at the idea. But agreeing was only part of the responsibilities that fell on her after making such a decision. Here she was, sitting in the dressing room with her David, to choose a decent outfit for the ball. Sapphire looked with doomed eyes at everything that was happening around her, and she had no other choice. After all, the girl had already agreed, and the principles of life did not allow her to change her decision. The young girl's gaze was simply lost among thousands of colorful dresses, and the thought throbbed in her brain. Does one trip to the ball require such extremely serious preparation? The maid was already here and brought a whole box of precious jewelry to choose from. The maid said that this will be her first ball in her life, so she should be incredible at it. Another maid from the other side was carrying a box with even more beautiful decorations, and explained to Sapphire that the owner of the Galbraith house should impress everyone present with her beauty and exquisite taste. Sapphire was confused and did not know which jewelry she should choose. And the maids also made a control shot in the head, saying that later they would test her knowledge of etiquette and her ability to dance. The girl began to choose some jewelry, although she had no idea what to choose. Sapphire didn't even know the names of the fireplaces that decorated them. The girl thought that the Duchess had a very difficult role. The boy jumped off the sofa and went to walk past the incredible number of dresses. David carefully examined each of them and stopped at one. Then he called his mother. The boy showed a dress of incredible beauty to his mother and said that she would look perfect in it, so she should choose this outfit for going to the ball. Sapphire examined the dress and was simply amazed by the taste of her little son. After all, she would not have guessed that such a color would emphasize her eyes and shade the color of her blue hair. The maids also liked the choice of the little boy, and they all unanimously decided that they would choose this dress for the ball. But the torture of a rich life did not end there for Sapphire. Hours of learning how to properly hold a cup, how to eat properly, which hand to pick up a fork began, and it seemed that there would be no end to it. But finally, the etiquette lessons were successfully completed. Sapphire bowed to everyone present and thanked them for the valuable knowledge, which she will definitely use in communication with rich aristocrats. The maids could not contain their surprise and said in amazement that at first they were worried because Sapphire belongs to the common people, and of course they did not believe that she could learn in such a short time. They did not stop complimenting the young girl, how they were impressed by the fact that she learned everything easily and coped with these lessons perfectly. Sapphire thanked them sincerely. The young girl noted that she really needed the experience when she worked for hours in the estates of rich aristocrats and watched how they communicated with each other. The maid announced that it was time for dance lessons because her tutor had just arrived. She introduced the respectable man to Sapphire, and the girl bowed in gratitude. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and Duke Galbraith entered. He looked at those present and asked how the Duchess's training was going here. The chief of police said that he was informed that Sapphire is diligently preparing for the upcoming social event. That is why he came to personally see how the training is going. The maids in advance began to tell how good Lady Sapphire was in studies, and told that she was doing very well and had already learned almost everything, except dancing. The maid pointed in the direction of the room where Sapphire was practicing dance lessons with the tutor, and reported that she was currently having her first lesson. That young girl could not cope with these damn dances. The tutor kept reminding her that she should shift her center of gravity to the left, and then her steps would be easier. One of the maids said aloud that she thought it was the dancing that the young Duchess had some problems with. They all saw how difficult it was for her to dance. Therefore, Chris decided to defuse the situation somehow and approached the couple who were trying to dance. He asked Sapphire if she had a problem with dancing, and she looked at the police chief in surprise. The Duke then suggested that he be her dance partner and help with her studies. She was so shocked by his proposal that she didn't even know what to answer him. The young girl began to make excuses that she hadn't really learned anything yet, and it was too early for her to dance with such a partner. In her mind, she worried about the fact that she would simply trample all over his feet. The Duke did not want to listen to these ridiculous excuses of the girl. He approached her, took her hand in his, and said that he was the one who invited her to the ball. Therefore, he is responsible for her education. The tutor explained that there is nothing strange here because at the social event she will have to dance with the Duke, and it would be extremely nice if she practiced with him right away. Then Sapphire thought that if the tutor himself gives such advice, then it is worth using them, and she agreed to learn dances with the Dukes. So they took each other's hands. The maids and their son David watched these exercises from afar, but they were all amazed by how well the young girl and the man fit each other as a couple. Young people have never been so close to each other, and they had the opportunity to take a closer look. But when their eyes met, a red blush appeared on Sapphire's cheeks. The Duke kept his eyes on his beautiful partner, and her heart began to beat even faster. She couldn't understand. They were doing the same thing with the tutor, but now she was starting to worry. When they were so close, the girl managed to see his face and was amazed at how beautiful it was, because before she did not even pay attention to it. The sounds of music captivated both young people, and they did not pay attention to those present. They surrendered to the sensations and deftly circled the hall. When the music stopped, the tutor said it was great. After the dance, Chris asked Sapphire if she had decided on her prom dress, and the young girl happily said that she managed it the fastest. Sapphire said that their son helped her in this very difficult choice, and in her opinion, this is the best dress she has ever seen in her life. The Duke asked in surprise if his son really knew anything about women's clothing. He did not expect at all to hear that the boy understands fashion trends. Then the Duke suggested to the young lady that for their next social event, he also wanted to choose a dress for her. Sapphire was surprised at his future plans for joint events. In the end, the Duke said that if she had any problems at the ball, she should definitely turn to him for help. She was impressed by such an offer. Until this moment, only she acted as a defender of other ordinary people from aristocrats, or as a rescuer of a small sick boy, and now the chief of police wanted to take on this mission. Sapphire realized that although he had offered to rely on him completely, she could hardly afford such a thing. Life taught her to independently solve all her difficulties. Then her little son jumped out of his chair and ran to her with his arms outstretched. As he ran up and hugged his dear mother, David said he was glad to be present with her at the event. David was a real man, so he offered his mother to rely on him as well, if she had any problems. Sapphire thanked her little protector. The young girl understood that now she is performing the role of David's mother, so she should be a gentle and loving woman. And besides, from now on, she also played the role of the Duchess of the Galbraith house, and this placed even more responsibility on her for her actions, although she should have been as careful as possible. At the social event, the most influential aristocrats of their empire were to gather, and Sapphire dreamed of taking advantage of such an opportunity and gathering more information that she was interested in regarding the abduction of children. Sapphire firmly decided that she should be as vigilant as possible and do everything possible to learn at least something new in this complicated case. Meanwhile, at Baron Tolman's residence, a young woman was holding a letter in her hands. She couldn't resist and immediately read its contents because it was from a very important informant. When she read everything carefully, she tore the piece of paper into 100 pieces and smiled evilly. The woman said that now Chris has a new wife and she really wants to see it. Finally, the day of the ball came. Duke Galbraith made the final preparations in his attire, wearing white gloves. He was waiting for this social event where he would introduce his new wife. The familiar voice of a young girl distracted him from his thoughts. The Duke turned his head to see her descending from the second floor, holding his son's hand. She said they were ready. The chief of the police was speechless at what he saw. At first, he didn't even know what to say, because Sapphire's appearance was incredibly beautiful. Everything was very well chosen in her image. But after recovering a little from what he saw, the young man said that such a dress suits her very well. Sapphire smiled, because she knew that this compliment was most likely to his son for such a good choice. Then the young girl decided to respond with something pleasant, and began to tell that he also liked his outfit and that he was very handsome today. The Duke thanked for the compliment. The young girl was embarrassed by the warm words and thought that although according to etiquette, aristocrats constantly compliment each other, she felt uncomfortable when the Duke said them. David could see that Mom was feeling quite uncomfortable, so he went over and gave her a gentle hug. And then he yelled at his father that you can't talk to his mother like that. Sapphire looked at her little protector and patted his head. She said that she was very pleased that such a brave knight, who did not care about his opponent, was worried about her. They began to hug again, and the little one happily climbed into her arms. So they stood, happily chatting, until the maid began to worry that the dress would be remembered now. The maid approached the young girl in time and stopped their caress. Sapphire decided that it really wasn't the best idea at the moment, and they should hurry to the social event. Herzog recalled that when he was very small, he was not allowed to hug his mother at all, and therefore he constantly felt alone and useless. When Chris watched his own son cuddle with Sapphire, he even envied the little one a little because he was blessed to have such a gentle mother by his side. The Duke couldn't take his eyes off when he watched his son and the young girl playing together, and he wanted so much to be a part of this happy family. When the couple finally arrived at the ball, Sapphire mentally noted that quite a large number of wealthy aristocrats had gathered here, which was to be expected from such an event. The young girl looked at the guests with interest, looked at the interior, whether she sometimes knew someone personally, and whether she had worked in the estates of the aristocrats gathered here. But the police chief also noticed with his watchful eye that she was looking at everything with interest and asked the girl if something had happened and if she was feeling normal. Sapphire apologized and said that it was just a rather unusual situation for her, especially since it was her first time at such events. Herzog added that she will still get used to attending such events. The man who met them in the hall was surprised and said that the Duke is so worried about his new wife, because for such a serious man like Chris, it is in the order of things. And regarding the girl, the man said that she was probably very lucky and lived like in a fairy tale. The girl blinked in surprise and did not understand at all what such a statement was made about. The young girl looked at the police chief, waiting for some explanation. But the young man simply cleared his throat and told her not to pay attention to this man's chatter. The man then apologized to the Duchess and said that he urgently needed to discuss something with her husband alone. The young girl only smiled in response and said that she would be happy to look around here herself, and he could take her husband even now. The Duke was uncomfortable leaving his wife alone, who was attending such an event for the first time, and there were urgent matters that needed to be dealt with immediately, and he said he would be away for a while. Now, Sapphire finally had an opportunity to freely move around the hall, and she aimed to gather as much information as possible. That is why she came here. Nothing was known about the whereabouts of the kidnapped children, but there was a high probability that this case was connected with human trafficking, which was engaged in by aristocrats. And the young girl decided that today she has a good opportunity to shed light on this hopeless case. But just as she decided to start collecting information, she heard someone say hello to her. She turned her head and saw that in front of her stood a beautifully dressed young woman surrounded by her girlfriends. She greeted Sapphire by calling her name. Sapphire asked with whom she had the honor to speak. A spectacular brown-haired girl with red eyes said that her name was Irene Tolman, looked at Sapphire with a kind of disdainful look. Sapphire started trying to remember exactly where she had heard the name Irene, and then it dawned on her that it was her that all the servants in the Galbraith house were discussing. She realized that it was Chris's ex, but as soon as Sapphire said her assumption out loud, one of her friends immediately pointed out that it was quite rude to talk to Duke Galbraith's ex-wife like that. Meanwhile, another friend unexpectedly came close to Sapphire and said that the Duke loved Lady Irene very much. And at the first meeting, calling her ex-wife is quite rude. Irene joined the conversation and began to prove that the Duke's son disappeared precisely because of the carelessness of one of the maids, and Lady Irene was not at all to blame. Sapphire looked confused at the number of women who surrounded her, and each of them tried to prove to her that Lady Irene was white and fluffy. At that moment, Sapphire felt rather uncomfortable among them. Irene's friends also added that it was Lady Irene who initiated their divorce because she was worried about the Duke's reputation after his son's escape, and they admired her self-sacrifice. Then these disgruntled women in general rushed at Sapphire with some complaints, telling her that it was such a noble act that Irene took advantage of some commoner and became close to the Duke. Sapphire only mentally noted that these women knew too much personal information about the Duke's relationship, and she had almost nothing left to add to her excuse. Sapphire wondered why this Irene put on such a show at the ball. Was she angry with the Duke, or just wanted to put sticks in his wheels? While Sapphire was thinking about what Irene was doing to bully the Duke's new wife like this, one of her friends shouted in Sapphire's face to say something instead of standing in silence.